Everyone told her the land was dead and the investment was a financial suicide mission. She bought 112 acres of ruined soil, a rusted tractor and a mountain of debt. But 1 year later, the very experts who laughed at her are now knocking on her door, begging to know how she did it. The air inside the Guernsey County Courthouse on that freezing March morning smelled of damp wool, old paper, and quiet financial anxiety. Frost clung to the high windows of the auction room in rural Ohio. Inside, two distinct groups sat on the hard wooden benches. On one side sat regional land developers with clean leather folders, waiting to scoop up foreclosed property for cheap commercial subdivisions. On the other sat 51-year-old Hollis Eberhart. Hollis did not look like a woman about to wager her financial survival on abandoned acreage. For 23 years she had worked as a heavy machinery fleet auditor, inspecting earth movers, mining rigs and industrial construction equipment across the Midwest. Her entire career had been governed by hard metrics, stress testing structural iron, analyzing maintenance logs, and identifying hidden asset value where surface-level observers saw only liabilities. When heavy industry executives needed to know whether a 200-ton excavator was worth rebuilding or writing off, they relied on Hollis. Now she sat staring at the county foreclosure ledger, waiting for Lot 14. When the auctioneer finally announced Lot 14, a dismissive murmur rippled through the developers. The parcel was a forgotten 112-acre farm tucked into the rugged hills outside Cambridge, Ohio. Its history was grim. 12 years of delinquent tax liens, a collapsed main barn, and 4 decades of aggressive chemical-heavy monocropping that had baked the topsoil into concrete-hard clay. To the corporate buyers, it was worthless, too eroded for standard agriculture, too uneven for residential zoning. An initial lowball bid of $80,000 broke the silence from a buyer looking to strip the gravel. Hollis opened her binder. Inside sat 3 months of rigorous due diligence. Satellite drainage profiles, historical hydrological maps, and exact calculations on bridge loan interest rates. She knew the land surface was dead, but her analysis proved that a robust natural water table and mineral-rich subsoil remained intact beneath the compaction. She viewed the exhausted farm exactly like a seized industrial engine, neglected but fundamentally sound under the rust. She raised her bidder card. $140,000. The gravel buyer countered at $150,000. Without missing a beat, Hollis raised her card again, $175,000. Silence fell over the room. To cover that bid and clear the back tax liens, Hollis was liquidating every dollar of her 23-year retirement pension. There was no corporate safety net behind her. The developer shook his head and folded his brochure. The gavel struck the heavy oak podium with a sharp crack. Sold. 10 minutes later, Hollis stood beneath the flickering fluorescent lights of the county clerk's desk, signing her name to the transfer deed. The local officials looked at her with quiet skepticism, seeing a middle-aged former corporate auditor taking on a property that had defeated 2 previous generations. But as Hollis walked out into the biting Ohio wind with the deed tucked into her coat pocket, her mind was already running spreadsheets. She had just bought 112 acres of hardpan clay, and the remediation audit was about to begin. At dawn the next morning, a biting wind swept across the ridgeline of Guernsey County as Hollis Eberhart stepped onto her new property. There was no sentimentality in her stride, no pastoral daydreaming about country sunsets. To Hollis, the 112-acre parcel was simply a distressed industrial asset requiring a rigorous forensic audit. Armed with a heavy steel soil probe, a digital pH meter, and her clipboard, she began her baseline assessment across the southern pasture. The initial diagnostics were brutal. Every time she drove the steel probe into the earth, it halted abruptly 3 inches below the surface, striking a layer of plow pan, as impenetrable as cured concrete. 4 decades of continuous synthetic chemical applications and heavy conventional tillage had completely destroyed the aggregate structure. Hollis extracted core samples across 10 distinct zones and logged the hard data into her ledger. The forensic soil biology was grim. The pH sat severely imbalanced at a hostile 4.9, while organic matter registered at an abysmal 0.8%. Worse still, across 5 test pits dug by hand, she found 0 earthworms, 0 fungal mycelium, and no signs of microbial respiration. In strict engineering terms, the topsoil had ceased to be a living biological ecosystem. It was merely inert, compacted dirt. Moving away from the dead pastures, Hollis forced her way through thick stands of wild thorn bushes surrounding an overgrown corrugated metal equipment shed. The sliding doors were rusted firmly into their tracks, requiring her shoulder and a heavy steel pry bar to break the seal. Inside, cutting through the dim gloom and decades of accumulated dust, sat a heavy silhouette of vintage German engineering, a 1981 Fendt Favorite 614 LS turbo diesel tractor. Hollis approached the machine with the practiced eye of a veteran fleet inspector. She wiped grime from the data plate and systematically evaluated the wear points. The front tires were dry-rotted and flat against the dirt floor, hydraulic hoses were brittle and cracked, and when she attempted to turn the main pulley, the 135 horsepower, 6-cylinder MWM diesel engine was completely seized. To the average observer it was 4 tons of iron scrap. To Hollis it was mechanical gold. She understood the internal architecture of these early 80s Fendt tractors. Built without fragile computer modules or proprietary software sensors, they possessed an over-engineered mechanical transmission designed for extreme industrial endurance. That evening, by the light of a propane lantern inside the drafty farmhouse, Hollis input the day's field data into her financial spreadsheet models. She ran a comprehensive cost-benefit analysis comparing 2 operational pathways. Purchasing a modern utility tractor along with commercial synthetic fertilizers would require an immediate equipment loan exceeding $160,000, a leveraged liability that would bankrupt the operation before harvest. However, investing $600 in replacement gaskets, filters and high-pressure fluid lines to resurrect the Fendt 614 LS, combined with biological soil remediation, shifted the financial risk entirely. Hollis closed her ledger with a sharp snap. The numbers did not lie. If she could rebuild the seized diesel engine and harness its raw drawbar pull to shatter the subterranean hardpan, the dead earth outside stood a fighting chance. The morning after inspecting the barn, Hollis drove 15 miles to the commercial farm equipment dealership in Cambridge to locate replacement parts for the 1981 Fendt Favorite 614 LS. Behind the parts counter, the service manager glanced at her vintage serial number and scoffed. He declared the old German tractor a dead weight of obsolete iron, impossible to source, and pointed her toward the sales floor. A sales representative immediately pressed a glossy brochure into her hands, pitching a modern, satellite-guided utility tractor loaded with proprietary computer modules and software sensors. The financing package demanded an immediate $150,000 equipment loan anchored by adjustable, high-interest bank debt. Hollis looked at the plastic dashboard and saw a financial trap designed to drain a farm's operating cash flow. She quietly returned the brochure, paid cash for a set of fuel filters, copper crush washers and 5 gallons of industrial penetrating oil and walked out. For the next 14 days, Hollis transformed the freezing, unheated barn into a meticulous heavy machinery clinic. Dressed in insulated overalls beneath the glare of hanging halogen shop lights, she methodically tackled the Fendt-seized power plant. Pulling the heavy cast-iron cylinder head, she exposed the frozen combustion chambers. For 4 days straight, she flooded the cylinder sleeves with penetrating oil, allowing capillary action to slowly dissolve the hardened rust and carbon binding the 6 pistons. Using a heavy breaker bar on the crankshaft pulley, she gently rocked the engine millimeter by millimeter until the internal assembly finally broke free with a deep mechanical thud. Next, she focused on the engine's precision core, the mechanical Bosch fuel injection pump. Decades of stale diesel had turned into a thick, varnish-like sludge inside the plungers. Working on a clean wooden bench with jeweler-like patience, Hollis disassembled the pump, cleaning every fuel metering valve and governor weight until the internal tolerances were frictionless. After retiming the injection pump to the engine, she hand-cranked the overhead valves, using a precision feeler gauge to dial in exact lash gaps. Moving to the rear chassis, she replaced the brittle hydraulic supply hoses and systematically bled the system, cracking open each fitting to purge trapped air from the hydraulic lines until pure, pressurized fluid flowed without bubble cavitation. On the morning of the 14th day, Hollis hooked up 2 heavy-duty commercial batteries and poured 10 gallons of fresh diesel into the scrubbed fuel tank. She climbed into the high steel operator's cab, cracked the throttle lever and held the heater plug switch. The thermometer outside read 28 degrees. She turned the ignition switch. The heavy electric starter engaged, turning the massive flywheel against stiff, newly restored compression. The engine coughed once, spitting a sharp ring of dark soot from the vertical exhaust stack. She cranked it again. Suddenly, all 6 cylinders caught fire. The MWM turbo diesel erupted into a deafening rhythmic roar that shook the dust from the barn rafters and vibrated the steel floorboards beneath her boots. Outside, the deep, mechanical thunder echoed across the valley hills, sending a clear, unmistakable message to the entire township. The forgotten farm was waking up. With the Fendt favorite 614LS fully operational, Hollis turned her attention to the Guernsey County soil's most lethal barrier, the subterranean hardpan. 40 years of heavy conventional tillage had created an 18-inch barrier of compressed clay so dense that rainwater pooled on the surface instead of penetrating into the aquifer. To resurrect the farm, that underground vault had to be shattered. Behind the Fendt, Hollis hitched up a heavy-duty 5-shank subsoil deep ripper, a massive steel implement engineered to plunge 2 feet below the surface. Climbing into the cab on a crisp April morning, she engaged the hydraulic levers and forced the heavy steel shanks down into the earth. Instantly, the tractor slammed into resistance. The Fendt's engine RPM dropped sharply as the implement struck the concrete hard plow pan. Hollis eased the throttle forward, tapping into the raw low-end torque of the 135 horsepower turbo diesel. Under extreme operational load, the exhaust stack released a steady plume of dark smoke as the turbocharger spooled up to maximum boost. The deep-cleated rear tires dug hard into the topsoil, fighting for traction until the mechanical drawbar pull finally overwhelmed the subterranean resistance. Below the surface, a dull, seismic rumble vibrated through the chassis as the thick slabs of compacted earth cracked and fractured. Slowly, steadily, the iron behemoth marched across the southern pasture, tearing open deep vertical fissures across the field. Yet Hollis knew from her career auditing fleet operations that solving a structural failure required more than brute force. If left alone through heavy spring rains, the fractured clay would simply settle back into an impermeable slab. Mechanical horsepower had opened the breach. Now she deployed biological warfare. Mounted directly above the ripping implement was a mechanical broadcast seeder loaded with a custom calculated cover crop mix. As the steel shanks ripped open the soil channels, the broadcaster dropped a precise application of daikon tillage radishes and winter cereal rye into the fresh furrows. This was a targeted biological intervention. The daikon radishes acted as living drill bits, driving aggressive, fleshy taproots down into the subsoil fractures to keep the compaction layers permanently propped open. Meanwhile, the dense fibrous root systems of the winter cereal rye rapidly anchored the topsoil, pumping liquid carbon down into the earth. This precise biological combination ignited the farm's dormant subterranean ecosystem. By fracturing the hardpan and injecting living root exudates deep into the soil profile, Hollis began restoring complex mycorrhizal fungi networks that had been starved of oxygen for decades. These microscopic fungal threads acted as an underground distribution grid, breaking down locked mineral reserves and transporting them to plant roots. Simultaneously, fresh oxygen flooded the deep soil fissures, stimulating beneficial soil bacteria responsible for natural nitrogen fixation. By twilight, Hollis shut down the rumbling Fendt and looked out across 50 acres of freshly ripped, seeded ground. She had not spent a single dollar on synthetic fertilizers. Instead, she had engineered a self-sustaining biological engine beneath her boots. By late April, the financial reality of resurrecting a dead farm confronted Hollis inside the pages of her ledger. Her retirement capital was draining fast. Between the initial foreclosure bid, mechanical overhaul costs, and bulk cover crop seeds, her operating liquidity stood at a critical low. Yet the fractured hardpan across the eastern slopes still required heavy nitrogen and biological activity to complete its transformation. Industrial synthetic fertilizers would cost over $40 per acre, an immediate cash outlay she simply could not afford. Instead of buying artificial chemical inputs, Hollis decided to invest in biological machinery, rugged livestock capable of transforming raw weeds into natural fertility. On a brisk Tuesday morning, she drove her heavy-duty pickup and borrowed stock trailer north into Ohio's Amish country to the Mount Hope livestock auction. Inside the crowded amphitheater, the bidding ring buzzed with rapid auctioneer calls and intense competition. Traditional buyers dominated the bleachers. Their bidding psychology followed predictable patterns. They aggressively overpaid for heavy, grain-fed commercial cattle designed for static feedlots, ignoring hardy breeds that required active pasture management. Hollis watched the electronic boards with the cool detachment of a senior fleet analyst. She wasn't buying pristine show animals, she was acquiring mobile soil remediation assets, and her purchase strategy relied strictly on cold cost per head efficiency math. Halfway through the afternoon sale, a lot of 20 heritage Hereford hogs entered the dirt ring. These distinct red and white pigs were energetic, rugged foragers, but commercial feedlot buyers dismissed them due to their slower indoor growth rates. As bidding stalled, Hollis ran the numbers on her clipboard. At $90 per head, their structural value as natural soil cultivators far outweighed their initial purchase price, offering an immediate return on investment. She raised her card and swept the entire pen at the market bottom. Minutes later, a flock of 40 Katahdin hair sheep trotted through the gates. Unlike conventional breeds, Katahdin sheep naturally shed their coats every spring, eliminating expensive shearing labor, and carried exceptional genetic parasite resistance. While traditional wool buyers stayed quiet, Hollis locked in the winning bid at $110 per head. Back on the rugged Guernsey County hillsides, Hollis immediately deployed her new livestock into an intensive rotational grazing system. Using portable electric fencing and lightweight solar energizers, she divided the overgrown eastern acreage into tight quarter-acre temporary paddocks moved every 24 hours. The Katahdin sheep acted as precision biological weed management, eagerly devouring invasive wild blackberry briars and woody brush that choked out native pasture grasses. Right behind them she rotated the Hereford hogs. The pigs turned the earth with their strong snouts, rooting out stubborn weeds while mixing the sheep's nitrogen-rich waste directly into the topsoil. Rather than paying thousands of dollars for mechanical diesel cutters and chemical sprays, Hollis let her livestock execute the heavy lifting. Day by day, the animals converted unmanageable brush into high-grade organic manure, systematically rebuilding the biological fertility of the valley floor while preserving her dwindling cash reserves. By mid-May, Hollis felt the quiet, persistent weight of social isolation that often settles over rural valley communities. In the diner booths and hardware store aisles of Cambridge, locals spoke of Lot 14 with skeptical detachment. To the surrounding farmers who measured success by clean-tilled, chemically sterilized brown dirt, Hollis's property looked like unmanaged chaos. She did not socialize or defend her methods. Instead, she focused entirely on infrastructure setup, installing miles of high-tensile mobile electric fencing hooked to self-contained solar energizers along the rolling hillsides. One humid Tuesday afternoon, that community skepticism crossed her property line. Warren Vance, a third-generation conventional corn and soybean farmer whose pristine bare dirt acreage bordered Hollis to the north, pulled his heavy pickup along the fence row and walked out into the pasture. Warren's farming model relied strictly on high-overhead industrial agriculture. Massive debt-financed machinery packages, synthetic fertilizers and routine chemical herbicide applications designed to eliminate every blade of non-commodity vegetation. He stopped beside a paddock where Hollis's Katahdin sheep grazed through a thick, wild polyculture of winter rye, tillage radishes and native clovers. He looked at the mobile solar fences then shook his head. "You're letting the weeds take your ground," Warren stated flatly, his voice carrying the blunt authority of decades spent in the valley. "I saw what you paid at the courthouse. If you don't spray this out and get a cash crop planted in clean dirt right now, the interest eats your capital. You'll default on your mortgage before harvest season." Hollis did not argue or offer a philosophical lecture on regenerative agriculture. She understood that Warren's perspective was rooted in generations of industrial conditioning. Instead, she walked over to her field clipboard and retrieved a digital soil moisture sensor display. "Look at the subsoil data," Hollis said calmly, holding the screen toward him. "Your clean-tilled topsoil across the fence is reading 14% moisture after last week's wind. My root canopy is holding 28% at a 6-inch depth. The soil biology is shielding the water table." Before Warren could answer, she opened her maintenance and financial ledger, revealing page after page of precise operational tracking. She showed him the acquisition costs of the solar energizers and the fuel logs for the rebuilt Fendt tractor. "I don't have a high-interest commercial equipment loan to service, Warren," Hollis explained with quiet dignity. "My operating overhead per acre is roughly 20% of a standard industrial layout. I don't need a record-breaking yield to survive because I haven't leveraged my future to chemical distributors." Warren stared at the spreadsheet math, his brow furrowed. He understood machinery logs and operational overhead better than biological soil theory, and the numbers staring back at him were indisputably disciplined. Unable to find a flaw in the financial ledger, He handed the clipboard back without a word, turned and walked back across the property line. Hollis watched his truck dust fade down the gravel road, then calmly adjusted the solar fence controller and got back to work. By mid-July, the intense summer sun had cured Hollis's first harvest of heritage winter cereal grains across the southern acreage. But when she pulled up the daily commodity pricing boards from the regional grain elevator in Cambridge, the numbers spelled immediate financial defeat. Consolidated market brokers were offering bottom barrel per bushel rates that failed to even cover standard harvesting fuel and equipment maintenance costs. Once freight dockage fees and elevator handling markups were calculated, selling into the standard wholesale pipeline guaranteed a net loss. It was the fundamental trap of conventional agricultural economics. Individual producers absorbed 100% of the physical and operational risk, while institutional middlemen dictated non-negotiable prices at the point of sale. Accepting those numbers would erase the remaining cash liquidity in her ledger. Hollis refused to hand over her hard-earned equity to regional grain brokers. During her 23 years auditing industrial equipment fleets across the Midwest, she had mastered complex corporate supply chain logistics. She understood that raw agricultural volume without independent pricing control was a fast track to farm foreclosure. To capture the actual market value of her regenerated land, she had to completely bypass the established commodity infrastructure. Over the next 7 days, she converted the drafty farmhouse parlor into a dispatch command center. She mapped out regional interstate transport corridors, analyzed cold chain freight load capacities, and constructed a vertical distribution model designed to connect her fields directly to commercial end users. To execute the operational pivot, Hollis secured guaranteed processing schedules with an independent, regional USDA-inspected cooperative facility and leased 2 mobile, climate-controlled cold storage trailers powered by efficient diesel generator units. Armed with forensic documentation, including independent laboratory nutrient density tests of her pasture-raised Hereford hogs and Catadine sheep, along with baking-grade protein profiles of her heritage small grains, she drove 3 hours west to Columbus, then east into Pittsburgh. She bypassed traditional wholesale distributors entirely, walking directly into the corporate purchasing offices of independent artisan stone mills and high-end specialty food purveyors. Her B2B negotiation tactics were clinical, professional, and uncompromising. While conventional producers often relied on informal sales pitches, Hollis presented guaranteed delivery matrices, rigorous cold chain temperature logs, and transparent cost per unit breakdowns. She demonstrated precisely how her rotational pasture system yielded superior, fully traceable culinary profiles that urban retail markets demanded. Within 3 weeks, her analytical discipline yielded decisive commercial contracts. A prominent Pittsburgh stone milling network signed a seasonal forward purchase agreement for her entire heritage grain crop at nearly triple the local elevator rate. Simultaneously, 3 premier culinary purveyors in Columbus locked in fixed-rate, bi-weekly supply orders for her pastured livestock inventory. To capture the remaining profit margin on surplus stock, Hollis launched a direct-to-consumer subscription network, delivering custom weekly farm packages to suburban households along the Interstate 70 corridor. By eliminating middleman markups and applying strict logistics management, Hollis transformed her isolated Guernsey County property into a resilient, high-margin direct-to-buyer supply chain right when her seasonal operating expenses reached their peak. By late August, a brutal 40-day drought settled over eastern Ohio, turning the rolling landscape into a high-pressure agricultural stress test. Day after day, cloudless, scorching skies baked the Guernsey County hillsides, while ambient temperatures hovered near 100 degrees. Across the fence row, Warren Vance's conventional corn and soybean acreage suffered catastrophic stress. Decades of heavy tillage and synthetic chemical applications had left his topsoil devoid of structure or organic matter. Without rainfall, his bare earth baked into brittle, cracked slabs that radiated extreme heat. Because his underlying hardpan prevented plant roots from accessing deeper subsurface moisture reserves, his crops stalled completely, with shriveled leaves turning brown under the relentless sun. On Hollis's side of the property line, the landscape told a completely different ecological story. The aggressive deep ripping she performed in the spring had shattered the subterranean clay barrier, while months of rotational livestock grazing and dense cover cropping had injected vital organic carbon back into the soil profile. This high-carbon organic matrix acted as a massive biological sponge. Scientific hydrology metrics dictated that every single % increase in soil organic matter allowed the earth to hold roughly 20,000 gallons of water per acre. While her neighbors' fields parched, Hollis's subsoiled root zones accessed a cool, protected subterranean water table, keeping her specialty grains and pasture polycultures resilient and green. Yet on the 41st day of the drought, sudden mechanical failure threatened to undo her biological progress. Hollis was running her primary PTO-driven irrigation pump off the rear of the Fendt 614LS to mist her high-value vegetable seed plots when a high-pitched metallic shriek tore through the air. Instantly, the pump housing seized violently, throwing a cloud of white drive belt smoke across the paddock. Hollis raced to the rear fender and disengaged the tractor's power takeoff shaft. Pulling the pump casing apart on the hot tailgate of her truck, she discovered that the internal impeller's main bronze load bearing had completely disintegrated under the sustained high RPM heat, locking the drive shaft. With local farm supply warehouses quoting a 5-day backorder on factory replacement units, Hollis faced an immediate crisis. 48 hours without supplemental moisture would cause irreversible cell wilt in her high-revenue cash crop seedlings. Armed with precision calipers, she retreated to her barn workshop. Operating under intense time pressure, she selected a solid cylinder of industrial-grade phosphor bronze rod she had salvaged from an old mining rig. Mounting it into her vintage benchtop metal lathe, she systematically machined a custom replacement sleeve bearing from scratch, checking internal clearances down to the thousandth of an inch. After hand-pressing the newly turned bearing into the cast-iron pump housing and seating a fresh graphite seal, she rebolted the assembly to the Fendt's PTO output. She engaged the clutch lever. The rebuilt pump spun smoothly without vibration, instantly sending a high-pressure stream of cool well water surging through the irrigation headers, saving her harvest at the absolute edge of failure. By late October, the golden hues of autumn settled over Guernsey County, bringing with them the undeniable harvest of Hollis Eberhart's labor. While the surrounding landscape remained scarred by the remnants of the summer's drought, the 112-acre farm stood out as a vibrant, deep green island of resilience. The livestock were heavy, healthy, and thriving on the thick regrowth of the pasture, and the soil beneath the surface had been entirely transformed. One brisk afternoon, the heavy crunch of gravel signaled a truck pulling into the lane. It was Warren Vance, the neighbor who had predicted her insolvency just a few months prior. Warren stepped out, his expression unreadable, and walked toward the southern pasture where Hollis was finishing a final inspection of the fencing. He looked out over the field, his gaze lingering on the lush, dense canopy of clover and winter rye that had replaced the barren dirt he knew so well. Hollis grabbed her soil probe and approached the fence line. Without a word, she drove the probe into the earth, pulling a dark, fragrant core sample from 6 inches deep. She handed it to him. Warren leaned down, sifting the soil through his fingers. It was dark, rich, and teeming with activity. He counted 4 earthworms in a single handful, a stark, tangible proof of concept that shattered every expectation he had held. The organic matter percentages tested at nearly 3.5% this morning, Hollis said, her voice steady. From 0.8% last March. The biology is doing the heavy lifting now, not the chemical jugs. Warren turned toward the barn where the Fendt favorite 614LS sat, its deep paint clean and its restored engine humming with rhythmic, mechanical health. He walked over to the machine, running a calloused hand along the cold steel chassis. He had been a farmer his whole life, yet he had never seen such a precise marriage of vintage mechanical power and biological precision. The high-overhead, debt-laden industrial model he had preached seemed suddenly brittle and fragile compared to what Hollis had engineered. He looked at Hollis, his professional skepticism finally replaced by a quiet, begrudging respect. He had spent his entire career in the valley, yet this outsider, with her audit logs and her rebuilt machinery, had achieved a level of land stability he hadn't thought possible. "I looked at the market reports for your livestock deliveries," Warren said slowly. "Your margins are holding while my conventional grain revenue is being eaten by inputs. I thought you were just playing with dirt. I was wrong." He hesitated for a moment, then added, "If you're willing, I'd like to see how you track these rotational cycles. I'd like to see the ledger." In that moment, the wall between the traditional past and the regenerative future dissolved. Hollis nodded, opening the gate to invite him in. Exactly 365 days after the gavel fell in the Guernsey County Courthouse, Hollis Eberhart sat at her kitchen table, finishing the final reconciliation of her fiscal year. The farmhouse, once boarded up and drafty, was now a warm, productive home. Before her lay the final audit, a document that represented more than just numbers. It was the story of a forgotten landscape brought back to life by disciplined human hands. Hollis traveled the next day to a regional agricultural preservation summit, standing before an audience of farmers, county officials, and environmental advocates. She did not use flashy presentations or abstract theories. She projected a simple, clear spreadsheet. The gross revenue was impressive, but the real revelation was the net profit. By refusing predatory high-interest equipment debt and bypassing middleman commodity brokers, she had maintained a lean, high-margin operation. She showed her balance sheet: zero long-term equipment debt, minimal input costs, and a sustainable bottom line that proved even land deemed worthless by corporate developers could yield a thriving economic future. As she concluded her presentation, Hollis reflected on the year. She had come to Guernsey County not as a farmer, but as an auditor of reality. She had found a failed system and chosen to rebuild it, bolt by bolt and acre by acre. She realized that the land had not been dead. It had simply been waiting for someone to show up with the right tools, the right data, and the willingness to do the work that nobody else was watching. She walked off the stage to the sound of steady, respectful applause, not the hollow praise of marketing, but the genuine acknowledgement of people who recognized that she had built something durable. She returned home that evening to the quiet rolling hills of her farm. She parked the Fendt 614 LS in the barn, the engine ticking as it cooled. She had proven that second chances were not gifts, but things that had to be earned through mechanical rigor and biological stewardship. Hollis Eberhart hadn't just bought a farm. She had secured a legacy, demonstrating that when you treat the earth with respect and manage your path with integrity, the land will eventually take you back, providing everything needed for those who are brave enough to plant the first seed. If Hollis's fight to resurrect forgotten land and vintage machinery inspired you, hit subscribe right now. Every week we bring you real stories of mechanical grit, soil restoration, and human triumph against the odds. Join our community of builders today.